It was the week before Christmas, and all through the North Pole workshop there arose such a clatter of chattering dolls and chugging electric trains, of squeaking bears and tinkling music boxes, of rattling marble games and whooshing toy airplanes, that Ragenholt, the foreman of the gnomes, had to raise his voice twice as loud as usual. "Torten!" he shouted. "Torten! You nearly finished? They want you up at the office." "In a moment," he said. The workman to whom he shouted, a thin little gnome with a thin little brown beard, looked up. "I'm almost done." He dipped the point of his paintbrush in the puddle of blue paint on his table and carefully painted a left eye on the golden-haired doll he was holding. Then he put the doll carefully down on the table and got up. There were some strands of golden hair on the floor. He looked around. Everyone was busy, and Ragenholt had turned away. Torten stooped quickly, picked up the hair and stuffed it in his pocket. Then he walked down the length of the long room, opened the door, and trudged across the snowy lane to the office building. Torten turned the door handle, which was shaped like a peppermint cane, and entered the office. Like the workshop, it was full of clatter, too. But here the clatter was only that of 20 typewriters, operated by 20 young gnomes with spectacles. One of these gnomes looked up as Torten came in. "The wastebaskets," he said briskly. Torten looked at the wastebaskets. 20 of them, full to overflowing. "Ah," he said, "the wastebaskets." "They need emptying," said the typist. "Yes," said Torten. "They seem to need emptying." He picked up 2 of them and started to carry them to the door. "Wait," said the typist. "Here's another letter for the wastebaskets." And he threw it skillfully so that it landed on top of one of the baskets Torten was holding. Torten looked down at the scrawly writing. His eyes caught the words, "Dear Santy, I would like a—" But he could not make out what followed, because his eyes were suddenly full of tears. He swallowed, blinked, and went on with the work that had been assigned to him. When crusty old Ragenholt blew his toy whistle at 11 o'clock, for the workshop kept late hours in these last days before Christmas, the gnomes trooped out into the moonful night, laughing and joking and singing carols at the top of their croaky voices. They filed up the hill past the silent stables where the reindeer slept. The snow crunched beneath their little pointed shoes and rose in sparkling banks high on either side. As they went by the house, where all the lights were blazing and every window showed its holly, the front door was flung suddenly open. They saw a stout familiar figure and heard a "Good night!" so cheerfully loud that it seemed to go rolling up to the iron blue stars, and then came bouncing back down again into the heart of each of them. They waved their mittened hands and shouted back, "Merry Christmas!" And then the door closed, and they walked on faster, smiling happily to themselves. But one face wore no smile, and Ragenholt, striding along beside Torten, wondered why. "It's been a busy day for all of us," said Ragenholt. "I'm tired. How about you, Torten?" Torten's thin little brown beard stuck out straight in front of his face, and a snowflake glistened on the tip of it. "No," said Torten, "I'm not tired." "Well," said Ragenholt, "I feel ashamed of admitting that I'm tired when I think of all the work he has to do." He jerked his thumb back through the air, indicating the house. "Yes," said Torten. "When it comes down to it," Ragenholt continued, "I guess there's no one in the whole world who does as much work as he does. reading every letter that comes to him from all the millions of boys and girls, and remembering all the things he remembers, which boys and girls were good and which were bad, and what all the good boys and girls want for Christmas, and then the big job he still has before him on Christmas Eve, when you and I can be snuggled cozily in our beds with our jobs finished until next year. Yes, I guess when it comes right down to it. Ragnholt had a strange feeling that he was talking to himself. He was. Torten had turned off the road, and Ragnholt saw his thin little figure trudging up a branching path towards a dark hut on the edge of the forest. I hadn't realized we were so near his home, Ragnholt murmured to himself. But what's the matter with him? He didn't even say good night. Torten opened the door of his hut and walked into the darkness. He groped around for a candle, lit it, and set it on the table. Then he stood before the table and emptied his pockets. The strands of golden hair, a rubber wheel, a dozen chunks of wood, 2 dominoes, a glass button, a playing card, and 3 tiddlywinks. He looked at the objects spread out before him, shrugged his thin shoulders, took off his red cap and threw it in the corner, rolled up his sleeves, and opened a big wooden box. The box contained a quantity of tools and brushes and paints and crude toys, most of them in an unfinished condition. One of these toys, a little wooden locomotive, he took back to the table, where he sat down and studied it. The locomotive had 2 wooden wheels, and one slightly larger one made of iron. He picked up the rubber wheel he had brought from the workshop and placed it where the 4th wheel should go. He frowned, twiddled his beard, and absent-mindedly put the tip of it in his mouth and chewed on it. A snuffling noise came from behind him. He turned around. The fat white head of a large polar bear was stuck through the open window, its chin resting on the sill, its friendly brown eyes twinkling a greeting. "Hello, Drusus," said Torten.
"Hello, Torten," said the polar bear.
Torten turned back to the table and continued his study of the locomotive. No more words were spoken for 10 minutes. Then the polar bear moved his head, in for a little more, snuffled a bit, and said,
"That's a pretty, what do you call it?"
"Locomotive," said Torten.
"Locomotive,"
the bear repeated, and then said it several more times, as he did when learning any new word that he liked. "And it's not pretty," said Torten. "Look at it. 2 wooden wheels, an iron wheel, and now it'll have to be given a rubber wheel because it's the only thing I could find. And it's just a wooden locomotive when all the locomotives this year are made of iron and steel and chromium and—" He shook his head.
"I think it's very pretty," the polar bear persisted. "Who's it for?"
"Oh, just for a boy," said Torten. "A boy I know."
"He'll like it," said the polar bear. "I know it's just the kind of toy I'd like if I weren't too old to play with toys. And you made it all by yourself?"
Torten didn't answer. He was grimly fastening the rubber wheel in place. More minutes passed. The polar bear snuffled, then coughed and said, "You were going to tell me tonight what happened." "What happened where?" asked Torten. "After the prince's messenger came with a glass slipper," the bear said eagerly, "and the ugly stepsisters wouldn't let the girl come out of the chimney corner to try it on and laughed at her and all. You were going to tell me what happened." "Oh," said Torten. "Well, of course, the prince's messengers saw Cinderella in the corner and asked her, and it fitted her perfectly, and they were married, and lived happily ever after. Drusus raised his thick white eyebrows in astonishment.
"Cinderella married the prince's messenger," he said. "I'd have never dreamed in a million years it would come out that way. Why, they'd never even met before."
No, said Torten. "Cinderella married the prince, of course. I'm sorry, Drusus. I'm afraid I can't tell any story properly tonight. There's so much work to be done."
"But I thought you had the day's work done," Drusus said. "Every night you keep on working here long after the others have gone to sleep, and you've never told me why."
Torten thought for a moment, then said, "Can you keep a secret?" Drusus thought for a moment, then answered,
"I don't know. I never had one."
"Well," said Torten, "I can't keep this to myself any longer. Drusus, do you know what happens on Christmas Eve?" Drusus' eyes gleamed happily.
"Of course I know that," he said. "Everybody knows that. That's no secret. How the star shines and the sleigh bells ring and the reindeer dance and he goes flying off and everybody sings for joy. And you know about the children and the stockings?" "Ah, yes," said Drusus excitedly, his words tumbling over each other. "They hang up the stockings, and he comes flying to the roof and takes his bag and goes down the chimney and fills all the stockings with care, and they leave little lunches for him, and all over the world, and down the chimney, and the toys and all, and they wake up in the morning, and they clap their hands, and everybody knows that."
Torten twisted his beard with his thumb and finger, and his eyes were dim. "Yes," he said, "it's a wonderful work. But what about the stockings that aren't filled?"
"What do you mean?"
said Drusus. "I mean," said Torten, "there's a rule about good children and bad children. We don't make toys for the bad children, and the sleigh flies right over their houses without stopping."
"Oh," said Drusus. "Well, yes, I can see there would have to be a rule. Otherwise," his eyes grew worried, "are there many bad children?"
Torten gave his beard an extra hard twist. "I'll tell you what I think, Drusus," he said. "I think there are no bad children. I think there are no bad children anywhere. Some children are better than others, that's all. It's only fair that those who are better should get more presents. But I think it's unfair that the others get no presents at all." Drusus was thoughtful, but still worried.
"But he loves children," he said, "and he wouldn't do anything that was unfair."
Torten struck his small brown fist on the table 3 times and said, "I know, Drusus, I know. I've tried and tried to find the answer. And the only answer I can find is there must be a rule he didn't make, but can't break."
"Have you ever spoken to him about it?"
Torten shook his head vigorously from side to side. "I wouldn't bother him," he said. "He's so busy all year that I wouldn't want to take even a minute away from him. No, but this year I'm going to do something about it myself."
"What?" said Drusus. "What can you do about it?"
Torten got up from his stool, walked to a big closet, and unlocked it. Drusus opened his pink mouth in astonishment.
"Toys!" he exclaimed. "Hundreds of toys!"
Torten nodded. "I've been making them," he said, "all year, with scraps and pieces that I brought home from the workshop every night. Nothing they'd want any more there. Colored rags, blocks of wood, buttons, extra wheels, little hunks of metal. There aren't enough," he went on, looking sadly at the overflowing closet. "There aren't nearly enough, and they're nothing like the toys we make at the workshop. But they'll fill stockings, and maybe some little girls and boys will find some fun in them Christmas morning."
"So that's what you've been doing," Drusus said. "Working all day and all night. That's what you've been working on."
Torten had taken a rag doll from the closet and was smoothing its stringy hair. "There's a girl in Nebraska who's going to have this," he said, "even if she didn't help her mother wash the dishes." He put the doll back and took out a toy airplane. "This is going to Utica, New York," he said, "even if he did play baseball on the neighbor's field when he was told not to." He thought again of that letter in the wastebasket that began, "Dear Santy, I would like a—" and a little smile twitched the corners of his lips. "And even," he said, "if what he really needs is a spelling book."
"But how are they going to get them?"
Drusus inquired. "I'm going to take him to them."
"You?"
"I!" Drusus lifted his eyebrows again until they almost went up behind his ears.
"How?"
"In a sleigh. I have a little sleigh, you know. Not big enough for all these toys, of course, but I've built an addition."
"But,"
said Drusus, "and I'm going to use one of the extra reindeer from the stables."
But," said Drusus.
"And I'm going on Christmas Eve," Torten said. "It's my own secret mission." On the morning before Christmas, while all the other gnomes were playing holiday games at the house and drinking hot chocolate and eating cupcakes with green, red, and white frosting, Torten was in the weather gnome's hut, asking questions. The weather gnome, a little pink-faced creature with a pure white beard, was rushing about from one side of the hut to the other, gathering reports from machines that told him what the weather would be like that night in every part of the world. As he rushed, he muttered, "Aha!" he said. "Low pressure over the Great Lakes. Northeasterly winds changing to easterly over south portion of Bay of Biscay. Well. Rain and fog in London. Yes. Snow flurries in southwestern Oregon. Good. What about Nebraska?" Torten asked. The weather gnome threw a puzzled look at him. "Nebraska?" he said. "Just a minute." He consulted the long report he had been writing and ran a stubby finger down the left side of the page. Natchez, Navarre, accident. "Nebraska, here we are. Cold and windy, with scattered snow and west portion ending towards daybreak." He squinted curiously as he saw Torten write this information on a scratch pad. "I didn't know you were so interested in the weather, Torten," he said. "Oh, yes," said Torten. "I'm very much interested." "I love weather," the weather gnome burst out happily. "All kinds of weather. Take snow now. There's a wonderful thing for you. All those little white flakes in perfect designs. And lightning, all golden bright in a dark afternoon sky. And simoons and monsoons. Simoons and monsoons," he repeated. "I love those names, don't you? Simoons and monsoons." A bell rang on one of his machines, and he dashed off to watch the latest report coming in. "Well, if that isn't a coincidence," he cried. "Monsoons over Madagascar." Torten wrote it down. At 4:00, Torten stood with a crowd of other gnomes in the stable yard, watching the reindeer being brought out to their places in front of the sleigh. The sleigh itself, gleaming red and white, was already loaded with its countless packages. As each animal came from the stable, cheers went up from the gnomes. "Hooray for Dancer! Hooray for Vixen!" they shouted. "Hooray for Donder!" And the reindeer proudly tossed their lovely heads in response, and the tinkling bells jingled on their harnesses. One by one, the reindeer stepped into their accustomed places, 8 of them, and then 2 more, and then another 2. Torten tapped Ragnhald on the arm and asked nervously, "He's taking more reindeer than usual, isn't he?" "Oh, why, yes," said Ragnhald. "There are more presents than usual, didn't you know? He's taking every reindeer in the stable tonight." Torten felt as though his heart had dropped into his left boot. With all the reindeer gone, how could he go on his secret mission? Another cheer went up as the last animal made its appearance. But Torten could not cheer.
He watched glumly as Snapper, an alert young gnome in a green and yellow coat, hopped into the sleigh and picked up the reins. "Giddy up," said Snapper. The reindeer drew up their heads, lifted their feet from the ground, and started their graceful flight to the house. "Hooray!" shouted Ragnhold. "The time is almost come. I can hardly wait. Can you, Torten?" He turned and found that Torten had not waited, but was walking off slowly, with head bent and hands clasped behind him. As the hour of sunset drew near, Torten sat on a bench just outside the door of his hut, brooding. He heard a seal bark far off on the Arctic ice. He heard the whistle of the wind in the forest. He heard the hum of many voices in the direction of the house, where everything was being made ready for the flight. On every other year, Torten had added his voice to that hum, and of course he would be on hand this year when the sleigh went into the air. But the failure of his plan saddened him, and the thought of all the children who would be looking at empty stockings next morning seemed more than he could bear. Another sound joined the bark, the whistle, and the hum. He heard a snuffling, and soon Drusus came lumbering around the corner of the hut. "Hello," said Drusus. "I was just coming to wait for you. I didn't think you'd be here yet, but I wanted to come and say goodbye and good luck." "Thank you," said Torten. "When are you going?" Drusus asked. "I guess I'm not going," said Torten, and he told Drusus what had happened. Drusus shook his shaggy head in sympathy. "That's too bad," he said. "That's very too bad. After all the work you worked." "It's not the work," said Torten. "I don't mind the wasted work. It's—" He bit his lip and looked at the ground. "I know," said Drusus. He waddled over and rubbed his cold, wet nose on Torten's cheek. "I wish there was something I could do." Torten raised his head slowly and stared at Drusus, and a look came into his eyes that made Drusus rather uneasy. "Of course," said Torten. "Why didn't I think of that before?" "Is it a riddle?" Drusus asked hopefully. "Can you fly?" said Torten. "That's an easy question," said Drusus. "No." "Have you ever tried?" "That's another easy one." "No." "Then how do you know you can't fly?" Drusus sat down. "That's a harder question," he said. "I'll have to think." He thought, got up, walked around in a slow circle, sat down again, brought one paw up to his mouth, looked at the sky, got up, shook his head, and said, "It stands to reason." "Why?" Torten persisted. "What do you mean it stands to reason? Why does it stand to reason? How does anything stand to reason? Why should a thing stand to reason? What do you mean by reason?" "Well," said Drusus, "it's hard to answer one question at a time, but when you ask a bunch of them all in the same breath—" He looked at Torten reproachfully. "I'm not as well educated as you are, Torten. You're not trying to confuse me, are you?" "No," said Torten. "But if you've never tried to fly, then I don't see how you know you can't fly." "I'm a polar bear," said Drusus. "Polar bears don't fly." "That's not to say they can't fly," said Torten. "If a reindeer can fly, what's to stop a polar bear from flying?" "Well, I wouldn't know where to start." "I've never flown either," said Torten, "but I imagine you start the way the reindeers start, by taking your feet off the ground." Drusus looked down at his 4 heavy white feet. He lifted one of them. "Good," said Torten, "that's the way." Drusus lifted another. "It's working," said Torten. "You're on the right track now, Drusus."
Drusus lifted a third foot.
"Why, you're wonderful, Drusus," Torten cried. "Splendid! Didn't I tell you could do it?"
"Yes," said Drusus, "but it gets more difficult from now on."
"I don't see why," said Torten. "You've already taken 3 feet off the ground. There's only 1 left, isn't there? And if you can lift 3, you can certainly lift 1.
"Well," said Drusus, "when you put it like that, it does sound easy. I'll try." And he lifted his 4th paw from the ground.
After those first amazed moments, when Drusus had found himself standing in the air, while Torten clapped his hands in joy, Drusus let himself come to the ground again with a thump and said,
"It doesn't stand to reason."
"Oh, bother reason," said Torten. "You did it, didn't you? And if you did that, there's no reason why you can't fly. Try it again. You can do anything you want to." So Drusus tried it again. He tried it several times, going a bit higher each time. And then, from a distance of several feet over Torten's head, he looked down and said,
"I can do this bouncing up and down all right, but that doesn't get us anywhere, does it? It's not really flying."
"Try kicking with your back legs and moving your front legs back and forth as though you were swimming," said Torten. "That's what the reindeer do." Drusus followed this suggestion, and to his surprise found he could actually move forward in the air. Then he performed several kinds of swimming strokes and managed to go higher, turn around, back up, and make a few graceful dives.
"This is fun," he said. "I always did like swimming."
"I'm glad you like it," said Torten, "because you're going to have a chance to do a lot of it later tonight." By the time that Torten's sleigh had been packed with Torten's toys and stood ready in the snowy field behind Torten's hut, the sun had gone down and night had come, with a silver splendor of moon and stars. Torten and Drusus walked down the road towards the house, towards the hum of voices and the flaring glow of 100 torches. The sleigh waited outside the house, piled high with packages. The proud reindeer, once more unharnessed, stood before it, surrounded by gnomes who patted their sleek sides and fed them sugar lumps and scratched their chins. There was singing inside the house and outside, and a feeling of something wonderful soon to happen. Torten and Drusus stood beside Ragnhald and raised their voices with his in Deck the Halls. Nearby, other gnomes were singing Good King Wenceslas, and a particularly small gnome with a particularly large voice was singing Wassail, all over the town. Suddenly this gnome stopped his song and shouted, "The star! The star!" All singing stopped, and all eyes looked up, and everyone drew a deep breath of marveling joy. High over the pole, a single star had appeared, and even as they watched, it grew and glowed with a brighter gleam, until even the light of the moon was dimmed, and the world was bright as day. A tinkling sound of sleigh bells broke the silence, a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. And as the sleigh bell song rang out in rhythmic measure, the reindeer danced in the snow, slowly, softly, and with graceful gait. The sleigh bells ceased their ringing. The reindeer once again stood still as statues, and the front door of the house opened. A stout, familiar figure, wearing shiny black boots, a red jacket, and trousers trimmed with white fur, a pointed red cap with a white fur snowball on its tip, strode rapidly down the path, waving first one white-mittened hand and then the other to the cheering company. He hopped into the sleigh, threw a thick warm blanket over his knees, while Snapper was harnessing the reindeer, and then took the reins. "Now, Dasher! Now, Dancer!" he boomed, and the reindeer flung up their heads. "On, Prancer and Vixen!" The whole team sprang into the air, pulling the sleigh behind it, while the watching gnomes shouted and whistled and jumped up and down in their excitement. High over their heads now, the driver looked down from the sleigh and cried, "Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night." "Good night, Merry Christmas," everyone chorused, and the chorus continued as the sleigh rose higher and higher and so high that it was only the tiniest black speck against the silver disk of the moon. And only when it was so high and so far that it could not be seen any more at all did the crowd of gnomes outside the house break up and go singing along their several roads. "I guess it's time for us to go too," said Torten. 15 minutes later, a puffin, flying clumsily homeward, saw the sleigh go by, and gave it a hoarse but hearty cry of greeting. 15 minutes after that, this same puffin, flying northwest at 5 miles per hour at 1,200 feet, saw another sleigh approaching. It passed him. 5 minutes later, the puffin, who was a slow thinker, said to himself, "That's funny. There were 2 sleighs, one with reindeer and one with—" He stopped flying, went into a dive, and alighted on an iceberg. "No," he said, "it couldn't have been what it looked like. Polar bears don't fly. It stands to reason." The puffin was wrong, as puffins usually are. It was what it looked like, reason or no reason. High over the ice-locked waters, the bulky white polar bear, Drusus, was swimming southward through the air, dragging Torten and the sleigh full of toys. His flight was not more rapid than that of eagles, nor was it as graceful as the down of thistle, but it was steady. They came across Melville Sound, and down the Prince of Wales Strait, and over Prince Albert Sound, and across Coronation Gulf, and the Duke of York Archipelago, and high above the Coppermine River, and through the Arctic Circle, and turned west at Great Bear Lake. They crossed the Mackenzie River and headed into the Yukon Plateau. Below them, the mountain peaks pointed like fingers to the sky, where the moon and the single star shone with such a light that all the other stars were invisible. Between the mountains, the waters of the lakes, like dark mirrors, sent up shimmering reflections of the moon and the star. As they flew near Dawson City, Torten pointed down at a large farmhouse and shouted, "First stop!" Drusus turned his head, nodded, and went into a slow spin, while Torten held tightly to the sleigh seat with one hand and fumbled in the bags of toys with the other. He brought out a fishing rod, just as Drusus landed on the farmhouse roof with a heavy thump. "Oh," said Torten, "I hope that didn't wake everyone up." He leaped from the sleigh and slid down the chimney into a big kitchen where the only light came from the moon shining in the window. A man's voice called, "Who's there?" A woman's voice cried, "What happened? Is it an earthquake?" A boy's voice yelled, "Something fell!"
Torten quickly put the fishing rod beside a stocking that hung from the mantel, scurried up the chimney into the sleigh, and said, "Away, quick, before they see us!" Drusus took off at surprising speed. He was only just in time, for as they flew away, Torten looked back and saw lights going on in every room of the house. As they headed south towards the Gulf of Alaska, Drusus said, "I came down too fast, didn't I?" "It was a little fast," said Torten.
"I forgot," Drusus said. "I'm heavier than a reindeer, and they've had years of practice. I'll do better next time. I'm sorry, Torten."
"It's all right," said Torten. "We have to learn these things from experience. You'll get the hang of it, Drusus." And Drusus did get the hang of it. From that time on, he came down on roofs at reduced speed and landed on tiptoe. No more families were awakened in Vancouver, Washington, Oregon, or Northern California. As they moved into Southern California, the roofs became flatter, and on flat roofs, Drusus was wonderfully calm and confident. On they raced across mountains and rivers and deserts and valleys. A rag doll stuck her tousled head from the top of a stocking in a kitchen in Nebraska. A box of marbles rattled down to the foot of a green sock in a ranch house in Nevada. The locomotive with the ill-matched wheels made a Chicago stocking chunky. A dozen crayons and a pad of paper were left on the table in a Mississippi cabin for a little girl who had never had stockings. And the boy in Utica would wake up to find a toy airplane beside his bed. 5 o'clock found them leaving the Florida Keys and heading north up the Atlantic coast.
"Are you tired?" Drusus called.
"No," said Torten. "Giving things to people makes me feel wide awake. How about you?"
"Oh," said Drusus, "I never get tired. I sleep so much. But we better hurry, hadn't we? Look."
The night itself was getting tired. The moon was growing paler. Drusus went faster and faster, and Torten filled stockings in a flash, but as they flew northward, a tiny thin streak of pink light began to show along the dark, remote edge of the ocean.
"It's almost morning," Drusus said. "What time does Santa Claus get back to the pole?"
"Sunrise," said Torten. "Always arrives at sunrise."
"Then we'd better arrive before sunrise, hadn't we?" asked Drusus. "We might have some hard questions to answer if we get in later."
"I've been thinking of that," said Torten.
"Are there many more boys and girls on the list?"
Torten groaned. "There's New York City just ahead of us," he said, "and then there's all New England and the Maritime Provinces, and I don't see how we can do it."
"I don't either," said Drusus.
Torten looked at the toys remaining in the sleigh and pulled his beard anxiously and squinted off at the streak of light. "We can't," he said finally. "Just one more stop, and then we'll head for home. Maybe next year." Drusus nodded.
"It's very too bad," he said, "but you've done a lot for one night, all things considered."
"Wait," said Torten. "Whoa, that White House on the crossroad. The one with the big chimneys." Drusus dove towards the house and landed gently on the roof behind the biggest chimney. Torten went down the chimney with a doll cradle tucked under his arm. He came into a room that was black as pitch. He stumbled along the floor beside the fireplace, searching for the stocking. "Where did she put it?" he murmured. He groped his way across the wide room, and finally his fingers felt the branch of a Christmas tree. As he knelt to put the cradle beneath the tree, he stopped and listened. Yes, there it was again. He was not alone in this room. Someone was breathing heavily and nearby. Torten held his own breath, quietly set the cradle on the floor, and tiptoed back the way he had come. He found the fireplace mantel again, moved along it, and stopped and listened. The breathing was nearer than before. Was he being followed? He stepped into the fireplace and bumped against someone else. "Oh," said Torten. Said someone else. And both tried to get up the chimney, but the chimney, which had been so wide when Torten came down it, seemed to have shrunk when he tried to climb up. His hands touched something smooth and leathery. His nose pressed into something soft and furry. Behind the soft furriness, Torten felt a chuckle, and then a voice that he knew said politely, "After you, whoever you are." Torten scrambled and squeezed his way past and up the chimney, and there he sat down and took a deep, deep breath of fresh night air.
"That you, Torten?" Drusus whispered wheezily. "I'm glad you're back. I was beginning to think I was hearing things with my ears."
"Like what?" said Torten.
"Like sleigh bells," said Drusus, "and hoofs."
"I'm afraid," said Torten, "you really did hear them." He looked over the other side of the big chimney, closed his eyes, gulped, and said, "Yes, you did hear them."
"What?" said Drusus.
But before Torten could answer, a stout, familiar figure pushed itself up through the chimney opening and sat down opposite Torten.
"Well," said Santa Claus. "Well, well, well, if it isn't Torten."
Torten twisted his brown beard nervously.
"You're pretty far from home, aren't you?" said Santa Claus. "How in the world did you ever get to Hackensack, New Jersey?"
Then Santa Claus looked over Torten's shoulder and saw the big white polar bear with 2 big white feet planted on one side of the ridge of the roof, and 2 big white feet on the other, and 2 big wondering eyes and pink mouth opened in astonishment. Santa Claus's own eyes widened in wonder, and his mouth opened too.
"And how in the world," he said, "did he get here?"
Drusus shuffled his feet and nearly slid off the roof in his embarrassment.
"I flew,"
he mumbled.
"And you talk," said
Santa Claus.
"Well," said Drusus mildly, "I always talked, sir, but I didn't know I could fly until I tried."
"I see," said Santa Claus.
"But whatever possessed you to try?"
"Well," said Drusus, and found he couldn't say any more and looked appealingly at Torten. "I told him to try," said Torten.
"What a remarkable morning this has turned out to be," said Santa Claus. "One of my gnomes in a Jersey chimney, and a flying polar bear on a Jersey roof. And just what are you 2 doing here?"
Torten swallowed and gathered up all his courage and said, "If it comes to that, sir, I was wondering just what you're doing here."
"Huh!" said Santa Claus.
And then the hmms came faster and faster until he broke into a chuckle, and the chuckle grew into a jolly laugh.
"Yes," he said, "I suppose you were. But what would I be doing besides leaving toys?"
"Toys?" said Torten. "Here? In this house?"
"Do you know something about this house that makes it a place to not leave toys?"
Santa Claus asked. "No," said Torten, "but there's a little girl. She didn't brush her hair when she was told to, and she said she was never going to brush her hair again,
and she threw her hairbrush and broke a mirror,"
said Santa Claus calmly. "You know it?" Torten said, and then bit his tongue because, of course, Santa Claus knew it.
"That was a pretty wild tantrum, wasn't it?" said Santa Claus. "Nothing like some I could tell you about, but still, temper. Too bad, because she looks so lovely when her hair's nicely combed, and her face gets all screwed up like a corkscrew when she's in a temper."
"But you left her a toy?" Torten said.
"Certainly," said Santa Claus. "Didn't you?"
"That's different," said Torten. "Her letter was in the wastebasket."
"Ah," boomed Santa Claus. So that's how you came to know about her."
The night was still so dark that Santa Claus couldn't see how red Torten's face had become.
"Those wastebaskets now," said Santa Claus. "I don't like wastebaskets, but you know what it's like at the pole. I read all the letters, but I keep the ones from most children in the golden book, but the others I don't keep."
"No," said Torten, I know, I empty the wastebaskets."
"The others I don't keep," Santa Claus continued, "I just remember. Did you know that?"
Torten was silent and stared at Santa Claus with eyes that were beginning to understand. Santa Claus knocked his hand against his head.
"There are no wastebaskets up here, Torten," he said. "And when I get other letters in later years from the children who've put aside their tantrums and their stubbornness and all, they go into a very special book indeed. There are no bad children anywhere. Some children are just better than others, that's all."
At this point, Drusus snuffled excitedly and nearly fell off the roof again.
That's what you said, Torten. That's what you said to me, remember?
Yes, said Torten in a small voice.
Do you, said Santa Claus. "I'm glad we agree. But we can't stay here, even for such an interesting conversation. It's almost morning, and I've still got so much ground to cover that I'm sure I'll never be able to do it all. Why, there's a girl in Nebraska who wants—"
"A rag doll," said Torten. "She got it."
"Eh?"
said Santa Claus.
"You?"
"Yes, but there's a girl in Chestnut Hill who wants—"
"A toy piano,"
said Santa Claus.
"She got it."
"Oh," said Torten. "You?"
"Yes, but in Utica there's a boy—"
"Airplane," said Torten with a grin. "Delivered."
"Well," said Santa Claus. Well, then between us, we've taken care of them all. And it seems this job is getting altogether too big for one man and one sleigh. When we get back to the pole, I have a little business proposition I'd like to put to you. That is, if you haven't made any particular plans for next Christmas Eve."
"Oh, no," said Torten. Yes, if you like,
"Bless you," said Santa Claus. "The sun will be up before you say what you mean. Let's be on our way home before we meet the milkman."
Torten, about to step down from the chimney to his little sleigh, felt a mittened hand press his arm in a friendly grip and then a pat on his back.
"Thanks, Torten,"
said Santa Claus. Torten, glowing with happiness, slipped into the seat of his sleigh. He heard the sudden tinkle of bells on the other side of the chimney, and then a voice,
"Hey, Donder! Hey, Blitzen!"
Santa Claus, the sleigh, and the reindeer soared into the sky and waited. "Hey, Drusus!" shouted Torten.
Hey,
Drusus shouted and left the roof, pulling Torten and the little sleigh behind him. As they came abreast of Santa Claus's team, Torten called, "Santa Claus!"
"Yes?"
"There's something I still don't understand."
"Hey?"
"I always thought there was a rule."
"There is,"
Santa Claus called back.
"There is a rule. But love has never lived by rules since the world began."
He waved and whistled to his reindeer, and both sleighs shot off together like arrows towards the north, leaving the sleeping world to awake to a merry Christmas day.